Hi, I'm Rena, and welcome to Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We, and What Are We Doing? This is not one of our regularly scheduled weekly podcasts. It's an extra that we're throwing out there with some bits that we cut from episode 20, Reagan. This is some of the material that we deemed to be irrelevant host banter, or cut for time and because it was digressive or repetitive. A warning before we jump in, this episode is not for everybody, and it's even more so in this case than with other irrelevant host banter bonus episodes. We originally recorded over 3 hours for the Reagan episode, and we cut it back to a little over an hour. We hated Reagan. It's a terrible movie, and we talk about why in the main episode. We get into that a bit more here. I wanted to say in putting this out there, I think that Sarah and I make it pretty clear who and what we are in the show. We are people who belong to the much despised coastal city media elite adjacent snowflake bunch. It's for people who, like us, are sad about the horrible thing that happened in Washington on January 20th of 2025. I normally cut most of the political stuff because nobody needs to hear us grinding an axe, but when I went back and listened to these outtakes, it honestly made me feel a lot better to hear this slightly younger version of myself grousing energetically about all the policies I hate that are being implemented again. Predictably, listening to the sound of our own voices saying things that I agree with makes me feel validated. And maybe the problem with America right now is that that's all anyone wants to hear. But freedom of speech does not equal entitlement to other people's mental space or eardrums, and life is short. What I mean to say is, if you love right-wing economic and social policies, you are probably going to hate this episode. But if you're with us in mourning the dream of 2008 and that other world we don't get to live in yet, where the structure of things is overall gentler on people, where the wrongs of the past are compensated for, and where we prioritize taking care of the planet, I see you, I am with you, and this one is for us. The right to free assembly also gives us the right to seek hope and comfort in commiserating among the like-minded. You're not alone. I have no advice to give. Advice is a pretty useless thing to give or receive. And we the people who live in cities and don't seem like we're real Americans under that narrow 1950s-esque judgment of what makes someone American enough to matter, our citizenship is just as good as anyone else's. We're still us, and they can't take that away. So without much further ado, here is a bunch of what we deemed to be irrelevant host banter from the Reagan episode of Biopic, a podcast story. Some of this sounds without context like we are having a conversation in non sequiturs. So if this is your first time listening in and you got this far, you should probably download one of our regular episodes or our introduction episode to get a better sense of what we're all about. I would especially recommend anything from episode 10, Cobb, onwards, because it took a while to figure out the sound quality. Enjoy, and thank you for spending some of your time with us.
And I was reminded of a line from an episode of The Office where Angela and Oscar are fighting about putting up one of those Ann Geddes posters of babies dressed as other things. And Oscar says about this poster, it's kitsch. It's the opposite of art. It destroys art. It destroys souls. This is so much more offensive to me than hardcore porn. And that is the line that I kept thinking of as we were watching this movie last night.
That's amazing. We were there on opening night, and I think there were a total of about 8 or 10 people in the theater. There was a row with us and our little pens with lights in them. Then further down from us, there was another person with a pen with a light in it who must have also been taking notes for something. And then another person down from, like, a few down from them. And then in front of us, there were about 5 finance bros. And when they came into the movie, they embraced each other, and we thought we'd be the only people there. And they were psyched to see this movie. More about them later, I guess.
Yeah. I was like, are they staying in a youth hostel somewhere? Is this like people who are just like here in New York on vacation? I know why we were there, but I don't understand why anyone would deliberately seek out this entertainment, because it's not good. And there are other movies playing right now. There were other movies playing in this theater that people have enjoyed and have said are good. Know why we were there. And it was to rub our neck at something that defies art. But I don't know what joy anyone else would get out of this.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure where to begin here, but I do want to acknowledge that, you know, I am a stereotypical liberal coastal elite. I did, however, grow up in one of the many cities that was blighted by supply side economics and by globalization and by like Milton Friedman economic theory. I'm well aware of the destruction that Reagan economic policy, as well as just like the sort of the punching down spirit of Republican government that Reagan fully embraced, even while pretending to be like a super optimistic dude, including the bashing of people who are on welfare and the dumping of the mentally ill on the streets of San Francisco. I'm well aware of the reality that exists, and that I further backed up my thinking around supply side economics with readings from radical media outlets this morning, like Forbes and CBS Money Watch, like communist rags that would have gotten me blacklisted back in the day. So I have a bias that is backed up by, you know, by reality about how these things work and don't work. I don't care for Ronald Reagan at all, to put it mildly. He's a bad person and he did a lot of bad things, and he had a real winner take all attitude that he infused the government with that persists into this day. That wasn't the way I was raised, because my parents raised me better than to believe that like one person should win and everyone else should lose, and that that's the right way to go about living. And if I just put a folksy smile on, everyone's going to go along with it.
Yeah. So I would say, if we're going to describe our politics on here, which I'm not essentially comfortable with as like a necessary thing, I would say I'm probably to your right. Like, I describe myself as socially and environmentally extremely liberal, but I consider myself a capitalist. I shudder when I hear the word revolution. I consider myself a reformer, not a revolutionary. I'm all about regulate, mitigate, ameliorate. And I am grateful that Reagan ended the Cold War, but I don't think he was the one, as they posit he is in this film. I think it was possible for there to be someone who could end the Cold War while having a more economically merciful society. Reagan said ketchup was a vegetable to cut nutrition for poor children. He appointed people to the Environmental Protection Agency that wouldn't admit that its purpose was to protect the environment. And James Watt, his secretary on that, I believe when people asked him about endangered bird species, pointed out the window and said that he saw there were lots of pigeons out there. And it's also that I absolutely despise anti-intellectualism. Like, I find folksy grating. And no, I won't say that is a 100% thing. Like, Bill Clinton can do down home, But if you listen to him for a few minutes, it's clear the man is sparkling brilliant.
Yeah. And like, I mean, and you flagged a couple of reasons why he was bad. You know, he was union busting. He destroyed the labor movement in this country. He was welfare busting. He introduced Christian fundamentalism into our government. And now, like, there is no way to extract that shit. He back on regulatory efforts around food safety and things like that. And I bet if you ask some of the people dealing with the listeria outbreak at Boar's Head, cold cuts right now, how they feel about Reagan and how he introduced removing government intervention into food safety, I bet they'd feel really great about it.
Yeah, I guess adding to that, he's the reason why our Supreme Court is fucked. The last Republican president before Ronald Reagan to appoint anyone to the Supreme Court, Gerald Ford, appointed John Paul Stevens because he wanted to get the most brilliant jurist out there. Reagan introduced this practice where you find the youngest and most extreme person you can, and elections hinge on it.
The whole spirit of him was sort of this energy of like, it is like winner take all. There is one winner and then there is going to be a loser. And that's basically like how this whole movie paints him, and paints him in a positive way for doing that. And it's troubling. Like there's kind of like this, everything's great, I'm gonna be governor. This sort of like weird, like bootstrappy optimism that is backed up by this like real hatred of anyone who isn't exactly like that. And this movie does occasionally pay homage to some of like the worst things Reagan did, such as firing all of the striking air traffic controllers and basically like shutting down labor unions in this country and destroying the middle class and the only bargaining chip people have to make sure that like they don't have to work for 20 hours a day. They go out of their way to justify all of these choices through ideologue mindset. Anyway, let's talk about this movie.
Okay,
I don't want to talk about Reagan policies anymore. We know he's garbage. Also, I was excited to note in the trailers, all movies that I would have rather been seeing, there is a ton of Caligula adjacent entertainment coming out over the next several months.
Yeah.
So you got that to look forward to. Gladiator 2, The Return, which is about Odysseus. So that's something to be excited about.
Yeah, although part of this experience made me never want to see a movie in theaters again. And just because when I am watching a movie and wind up hating it, I want to be free to like yell at the screen and say I hate this and not have to deal with how my rudeness is affecting other people in the theater. I guess I'm too accustomed to watching movies on a smaller screen at home. And one thing I hadn't thought about when we've rated bad movies is just how much more excruciating it is on a big screen where you're trapped there and you can't get up and walk it off. And the music is very dramatic. There was a composer in the golden age of Hollywood called Dmitri Tiomkin, where his soundtracks are these earworms that are super heavy and super dramatic. And this music wasn't like his music, but it had a similar, I am going to use this to make you think this way kind of thing when it kicked in. And I doubt there were more than 5 solid seconds at a time out of this picture where I was not cringing in my seat wanting to make it all go away. I didn't like where they showed my buddy Robert Oppenheimer as like, ooh, is this guy a plant? There were points in this film where I just had to close my eyes. I occasionally like leaned my head on your shoulder for support. It was so hard to take. But I agreed with the premise, but given how they were bonking me on the head, I felt this is very it was counterproductive.
Well, it was propaganda too. You know, I mean, I agree that the back end of Soviet-led communism was not great. However, I will say that like there was no nuance to that here. There was no nuance to what we saw, or, you know, acknowledgement that maybe like we need to investigate ourselves as well. You know, I mean, democracy isn't perfect. And I'm about to get myself blacklisted like my friend Dalton Trumbo here, but we're really, really trying something here with the point that we're making about how evil the Soviet Union is. Part of that is because they don't let people worship God.
I wrote here, I hate communists and I still resent this manipulation. I have never felt anything but bored sitting through any gathering of spiritual or religious community. I have never felt anything but bored and like I wanted it to end. But yes, I still believe people should absolutely have the right to worship, and that was one of the things that was wrong with the Soviet Union.
And then it's 1949, and who should show up on the scene but Nancy Davis, the blowjob queen?
Sarah, this is something I was unaware of. Can you please tell me how Nancy Davis earned her reputation as the blowjob queen of Hollywood?
The long and short, I'm going to read an article from Slate here. The long and short of it is that the former First Lady became a trending topic on Twitter in 2021 after an old anecdote concerning her skill at fellatio during her Hollywood days resurfaced. There was a 1991 book by Kitty Kelly about Nancy Reagan that Nancy Reagan was known to give the best blowjob in town. And ultimately, this is not necessarily the case. Let's see here. I'm just looking through.
You mean that she was not good at giving blowjobs, or that she was not famous for it?
It sounds like maybe, she gave some blowjobs, but like who didn't?
To who and when?
Possibly Spencer Tracy, a boyfriend who got run over by a train, a man named Benny Tao, who said that she wasn't his. Okay. She knew a lot of people. She was a bit of a gadfly. Just looking through here. Yeah, it sounds like Spencer Tracy helped her a lot. And then the head of casting at MGM, who was known to demand sexual favors. But I'm not finding any details about specifics and how many people. There's nothing wrong with getting around if you're gorgeous and young and you're a movie star and whatever. Like, do it. Go for it. Everybody do it. However, if you're gonna, don't turn around and be terrible to everyone else about it. And she seems to work steadily, but I would say that here's how you know she's not a great actress. One time, one of my friends was watching a movie that she was in called The Shadow with Alec Baldwin, and she said, "The way she acts reminds me of the way you act, Sarah." Mm-hmm. She's not a good actress. So it's a burn on everyone. She's a working actress, but I don't think that she's ever quite been able to get off the one note that she's on. And she's very much on that one note in this movie. It comes right after he's told Nancy that all he wants to do, I just want to do good in this world. And again, the Forrest Gumpy simpleton energy coming off of him at certain points is really, really annoying because it's so false. And at this point too, there's that whole scene that you mentioned where Jon Voight is somewhat effective, where he loses his shit over the motherland. So I used to shop for shut-ins when I was a teenager because I was a really good person. There was one woman that I shopped for who would kind of trap you in her house to talk to her because she was really lonely and it was sad. That was the vibe the Russian politician who's sitting there with Jon Voight was giving me because he rolls out his slide projector and I was like, this guy is like, oh my God, can I leave now? Can I please leave? And Jon Voight is just bringing out his files and whatnot and talking about Reagan again and how magical he is. This also is infuriating because there's a complicated set of reasons involving union stuff and breaking up of his talent agency because they also wanted to go into producing that made him all you know what? I actually hate unions now because he was going to lose money. That is why the party left him. I hate that shit so much whenever someone's like, the party left me. And I'm like, maybe you didn't progress, you dinosaur. I can't with like the unwillingness to sacrifice for the greater good, even in a small way. I'm not like an extreme communist, you know that. But even just the idea that like making any sort of sacrifice is an offense to your freedom and to your humanity. All of this bad, like, I deserve to have whatever I want because I worked hard for it energy of this movie, or even like, I just deserve to have whatever I want, period, because I'm an American energy of this movie is so dark. Like, this is a very, like, dark vision of what good is. When he said that, I had like a visceral reaction to it because it's something we've been hearing a lot from other politicians about like the party leaving them. And it's like, no, you just went nuts. You had a brainworm and you humiliated your wife and she killed herself. And then you had her body disinterred from your family plot. And then you decided you hated vaccines and the party left you. Like, no, it fucking didn't. Like, you decided that it was inconvenient for you to have to make sacrifices. You decided that it was inconvenient for you to have to pay taxes or to have to acknowledge certain truths about certain things that make you uncomfortable and make your feelings hurt and force your brain to work too hard. And that's why the party left you. That's why your views don't fit it anymore. It's not something that people did. It's you changed for the worse. You know, I studied soap operas, so I don't understand this shit anyway.
Well, I'll note here, I dislike Carter almost as much as I dislike Reagan. He was a terrible president, and his incompetency... there is a person I love very dearly who I will not name on this podcast who once said to me, Jimmy Carter drove me out of the Democratic Party and George W. Bush drove me back into it. But I was so resentful in this movie that I just couldn't bear to see them make mincemeat of well-meaning, naive Jimmy Carter. And at this point, I took a bathroom break and you said, you are coming back. So I left my handbag there. I think there was also some point before this where I just couldn't stand it and I was taking some notes. So I got out of my seat and like crouched on the floor of the row behind me just to get away from it for a moment and catch up on my note taking. Okay. This is the number one reason I hate Ronald Reagan, ripping the solar panels off the White House. And it has become a thing. As global warming has gotten worse and worse and worse, one administration tears them off. Republican administrations tear them off. Democratic administrations move them back in. And we would not be in the mess we're in right now if we needed to have, our top priority needed to be, let us take whatever... much more painless than what we need to do to even begin now. Mitigative, ameliorative steps. Let's set a good example with this. If for nothing else, I would despise Ronald Reagan for ripping those solar panels off. Well, and politicizing what is about saving us all.
A Democratic Speaker of the House could go to the hospital and visit a nearly assassinated Republican president. And I was thinking back on Gabby Giffords, for example. You know who didn't go visit her in the hospital when she got shot in the head? John Boehner, you know? And it would have been political suicide for him to do so. Mitch McConnell didn't lose.
But they play this scene with the yellow paper like Reagan's doing some kind of evil genius thing where he's pretending that he's senile in writing all this stuff down on yellow paper and leaving it around for it to somehow make its way to Viktor Petrovich to hand directly to Brezhnev.
We're back at the genius side of the pole as opposed to the derp-a-derp, folksy American hero side of the pole. We go back and forth. I never identify Dana's last name, but Dana, I'm pretty sure it's Dana Rohrabacher. I don't know how many other Danas wrote speeches for him. So Dana Rohrabacher was probably an agent of influence from Russia. He many times visited Russia. He has historically, he expressed a lot of pro-Russia and pro-Putin opinions. Early in his career, a KGB agent, and some others visited Rohrabacher in DC, and he became close friends with Vladimir Putin. So that's just another bad person Reagan brought into our midst.
Yeah, we get a childhood flashback of little Dutch, which is Reagan's childhood nickname, learning about how to fight bullies. This was yet another moment when I just closed my eyes to make it go away. And oh, look, Dana bought a blazer.
Um, and that was really offensive to me. It was bullshit. It was a stupid way to acknowledge it, and it was offensive to the people who have suffered and continue to suffer as a result of his way of being and his policies.
His first off, if you look at the landslide of 84, poor Walter Mondale never stood a chance. One of my sources on this era is Randy Schultz's And the Band Played On, which, yes, he was wrong about Patient Zero, but he was right about the Reagan administration ignoring the AIDS crisis. So we cut to the debate prep where Ronnie is terrible with numbers and Nancy goes all shrill.
Oh my God.
Again,
let Ronnie be Ronnie.
She's like, instead of cramming his head with useless numbers, why don't you let Ronnie be Ronnie? And she talks through this. And I feel insulted. I detest anti-intellectualism. I detest people who don't admire intellect. And one of the things I admire about parliamentary systems is you cannot get to the top job without intense verbal acuity. And yes, I think that the kind of complex judgments and being quick on your feet when you're the PM of Britain and you have to be able to reply in PM cues, it means you're never going to get a Reagan or a Trump or a George W. Bush. Like, even Boris Johnson knew how to use a thesaurus, and that is my Anglomania acting up. If any of a bunch of our recent presidents had to deal with cross-examination where they had to think quick on their feet, they never would have gotten to that spot. And of course, his favorite movie is The Sound of Music, which is just such treacle. But we do get to at least watch a scene with handsome Christopher Plummer from The Sound of Music, which is a better movie than this.
God, he's so dreamy. I was just like, oh my God, it's movies. Sexiest DILF. I'm excited to see him. And then he goes away. And they point out that Reagan will be the oldest president in history if he wins. And she's got on a nightmarish wig. And they're making deals about getting their oil from the Saudis instead of from Russia. And Margaret Thatcher is like, but won't your Texans be upset about this? And Reagan's all, Texans love money, but they love their freedom more. And yeah, you might want to ask the head of the former company known as Twitter and Joe Rogan how they feel about loving their freedom more than they love their money because they moved all their business to a state where they wouldn't be taxed. I know that Texans, all they care about is their freedom. They don't care about money, right? In that state. That's why they have tort reform where you can't sue doctors. And yeah.
I want to say Leslie Ann Dunn is the worst Thatcher I've ever seen. Meryl Streep's Thatcher was just amazing. Even though the Thatcher movie she did was made by people who clearly did not like Margaret Thatcher, she made her a full human being and sympathetic and did so much more for Thatcher in that movie than this one does for Reagan. And then there's also Gillian Anderson's Thatcher in The Crown was rather two-dimensional. It verged on caricature, but it was still a Thatcher. This is a nothing.
She's not even trying. We have our first summit in Reykjavik where Reagan is meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev. It's once again like look at Reagan, how he dunks on everyone and he's so much better than everyone because he's so smart. And the Reagans stay in some child's bedroom and they're supposed to feed the kids goldfish. And Reagan kills the goldfish and leaves the child a note because that's the right thing to do. And he's late for something because he's writing a note to a child. Look what a great guy he was, you guys. He was perfect.
Right. So I hate myself for interrupting.
No, that's okay.
Okay. So we're at this summit. There is a "This is how the world ends" needle drop. There is awe on John Voight's blurry face. And yeah, there's something where they go for a walk all folksy style. Yeah, I'm glad the Soviet Union was defeated. It's a shame we didn't do a better job at encouraging the spread of encouraging liberal democracy.
I was just going to say, I've seen Bridge of Spies. I know that the Iron Curtain was not a good thing.
Yeah, but he's all worried about being impeached, but we are now living in a reality where, like, dude, impeachment means nothing. He's not going to get voted out. Impeachments happen all the time now. Nobody fears it anymore. Impeachment is a slap on the wrist because you're never going to get enough votes to actually move someone out of office. And even if you did, their administration's still there with all the flunkies they brought in to keep doing whatever their backers paid for. And I have to, like, this is making me love Richard Nixon because he actually wanted to avoid being impeached. Like, oh my God, there was a time when horrible presidents feared being impeached.
I mean, this just reminds you that there was a time when people had shame about doing bad things and that it wasn't all about just this idea of like, what are we here for but to win. It's a huge bummer, like, to see this, like, where it's like even Reagan had shame until he figured out a way to work around it. Oh, and John Voight starts this thing up when the Iran-Contra thing happens, too, that, like, the American people are incredibly forgiving if their leaders acknowledge that they've done wrong. And I'm like, sometimes. Are they in a cult? Because if they're in a cult, then certainly, like, they'll let all that shit slide. It's all cool.
So again, I am happy that the wall fell, but I don't think Reagan was the one. Don't understand why we had to doom the planet and destroy all framework for a more gentle, merciful economics, a less harsh world, in order to do it. And then there's a needle drop to Sweet Child of Mine, and you can guess how I feel about that. And down comes the wall. And so I remember where I was when the Berlin Wall fell. My family was on a trip to the historical reconstruction village of Old Sturbridge Village, Massachusetts. We were spending a long weekend there, and I came down with strep throat. My mother was able to find a doctor pretty quickly, so we went on seeing Old Sturbridge Village. I was reading the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was in the school library. Yeah, there was a lot that I missed from being that young. I was in 4th grade at the time, and my strongest memory from that trip, we might have seen footage of the wall falling on a TV, I don't think I knew the significance, was there was this ox behind a fence, and the ox had a very runny nose, like liquid drippy snot runny nose, and it kept sticking its tongue out to catch the drips from its nose, and just standing there at this fence watching the ox catching dribbles of snot from its nose with its tongue. And that is my strongest memory of when the Berlin Wall fell, because I mostly remember my mother saying subsequently, oh, that's where we were when the wall fell. And it's perhaps I'm only telling myself that I remember seeing footage on TV, because my biggest memory of that weekend is this ox lickety drinking its own snot. And again, huge fan of the Berlin Wall falling. I find it severely disturbing that we have a generation of college students who don't understand why the Berlin Wall falling was a good thing.
It's a fascinating memory.
So do you remember where you were when the Berlin Wall fell?
I just looked up the dates to see if I could try and like track where I was and when I was, and I don't remember. I remember when it happened, and I remember like people talking about buying pieces of it, which I heard that they were on sale in very strange places like Sears. And I remember it being a big deal because my mom, was telling me about, like she traveled through Europe when she was in college and talking about like going through Checkpoint Charlie and how scary that was and everything. Like talking about like it was scary. My dad worked in Germany for a period of time and talked about like that time. I mean, I know it was bad. I remember like learning about like East and West Berlin and like the fact that there were two Germanys. Like I remember the maps that had that. But yeah, I mean, they make it out like Reagan personally took that wall down, which I mean, I think that there were more complex reasons for that.
Yeah, this movie has no tolerance for complexity, which
No.
is incredibly grating every second of it.
Well, and I think I
And
mentioned, oh, I'm sorry.
what's your deconstruction of my memory of this ox?
I mean, it's fascinating. It's fascinating and specific. And I'm not jealous of you going to Old Sturbridge Village, having recently been back to Colonial Williamsburg. It's pretty boring to go back to olden times and watch people make stuff like that.
I actually
I
loved
know
those
you
places as a
do.
kid. I loved those places because there were women in dresses with big skirts.
You do love a big skirt. I will say that we spent a bunch of time in Colonial Williamsburg with the guy who was the printing press expert. It takes a very simple view of the way the world works.
Yeah, the sort of director who would make a Reagan movie that people like us could enjoy and take seriously would have been someone who took a more subtle 360-degree approach, and given who produced this movie, would have never been hired for this movie.
Yeah.
You've seen Vice. I haven't. Would you say that Vice made Dick Cheney more sympathetic and human than this movie, this
It's
hagiography made Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, I would say it's hard to feel a lot of sympathy for Dick Cheney, but I would say that it's definitely more balanced. It might even skew a little bit, not a hit piece, but certainly like it's a much more critical look. I mean, I think there is a world in which you could make a movie that praises Ronald Reagan. I'm not saying I want to see that, and I'm not saying I would agree with its fundamentals, where you could look at the fact that he did a lot of crazy shit with foreign policy in terms of deconstructing communism that did work without being so worshipful of him to a degree. Like, I don't even know how to describe how worshipful this film is of him, because the word hagiography doesn't even feel like it fits to the level that this worships him.
Well, remember that word we came up with, Oscarbation? This movie has a number of bad of terrible Oscarbatory performances where people are giving all this Oscar speech energy with this terrible script.
Yeah, and it's I appreciate very much that, like Dennis Quaid has been out talking to the media about how the marketing of this film is being blocked by, the political agenda of the woke mob or whatever. I find this very comical because it's ascribing a level of principle and ethics to Mark Zuckerberg that is hilarious to me. Like, that guy doesn't care about anything except money. He let like ethnic cleansing happen on Facebook. I love the idea that they're acting like anyone in the marketing and sales industry and media is guided by like these principles of blocking, Reaganomics. Like, it's kind of like just pay him more. Pay him more. Like, you can't break through my algorithm for the same reason that like baseball doesn't break through my algorithm. It's because I don't care about it or I hate it. If something doesn't get to me on Facebook, it's because because I'm not clicking the right things. Get mad at the algorithms. Don't get mad at Mark Zuckerberg and say that it's all a plot to block you. Like, are you marketing on Truth Social? I bet they'd love this movie over there. Advertise between all like the Russian bride and scam coin advertisements if you want to make sure you're reaching people. It's just ridiculous to act as if like this movie isn't reaching people because it's some plot. It's like, just give them more money, have them add more keywords to the search. And yeah, and just the Oscar-batory nature of this. Like, they think they're making a good movie.
And at this point, one of the finance bros in two rows up from us, he couldn't take it anymore watching his hero fall apart and left the theater. But hey, to be fair, I crouched behind the seat and left the theater for different reasons relating to this movie. And actually, these scenes were genuinely touching, vaguely.
I
watching
agree.
Someone fall apart. She's either shrieking or has tears in her eyes throughout the movie. And it's all so overdone. Is she like trying to fix her reel by showing how well she can cry on cue?
I mean, she looked like just like a demented Nancy Pelosi wearing a wig in this movie. Like, Nancy Reagan's not my favorite either, because, you know, every 6-year-old should be forced to advocate for themselves and to be responsible for saying no to, you know, drugs. But she was a beautiful woman. They really failed to capture that in this movie. And, you know, I'm going to bring up my boyfriend, Bryan Cranston, again here, because I was thinking about like how maybe you can't play certain leaders to a certain, you know, like you can't play certain leaders who have like sort of like attributes that are exaggerated or affected. And he was pretty good playing LBJ in All the Way in both the movie and on stage. So it can be done.
So caveat here, I love filthy LBJ as much as I know FDR is the one I should adulate, but I've been slowly working my way through Robert Caro on Lyndon Johnson for the past 20 years. And I actually love Lyndon Johnson because he was a scoundrel who cashed his chips for civil rights.
Mm-hmm.
Our shit politicians nowadays cash their chips to get tax cuts for the wealthy. So it's a tale of a villain who used, there's that quote, I've lost the South for a generation, and he was off by like 2 or 3. And that's the miracle of Lyndon Johnson. And he's this character study. Robert Caro has been writing about Lyndon Johnson since before we were born. But I'm going to get through that for when we do All the Way. Actually, I'm a huge Lyndon Johnson fan. And
me too.
I think that one of the problems with the left is that they love to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Like, they're so down on him about the war that they won't look to him for an example of this is how you actually get things through Congress.
Yeah, he was. And I think when time passes, Joe Biden is going to be considered as transformative a figure as LBJ, because he was a political operator, and you underestimate that man at your own peril. And it's the same thing with Lyndon Johnson. Like, you can look at him and be like, what a folksy old asshole that guy is. But he made it happen when it counted. Watching this too, like the wall comes down and they show that as if it's this great triumph of Reagan. And, you know, one of my favorite movie scenes in the history of ever is there's a scene towards the end of Charlie Wilson's War where you see Tom Hanks and Philip Seymour Hoffman talking about the triumph of arming the Afghanistan soldiers and defeating the Soviets, and how that does eventually lead to, you know, like that is part of the cause of the fall of communism, is the over-indexing and overspending in Afghanistan, and like, don't fight a land war in Asia. And he references this proverb about whether or not something is good or bad is all about waiting and seeing. It's the same thing with this. Like, yeah, like Reagan, like they capture, and it's so irresponsible. And it's, again, like art failing to examine itself and failing to acknowledge that like these things didn't happen in a vacuum and there were effects from it. And that's why, as I said, like they would never use this framing device, but the idea of a framing device around like a young Putin meeting Viktor Petrovich, the guy who ruined Chernobyl, and talking about the fall of communism would have been an interesting framing device, because you see like what happened as a result of that fall of communism is complicated and messy and led to all sorts of other bad things that happened. And Reagan's policies felt good at the time, but they led to all sorts of other problems that continue to today and that persist into our politics and have poisoned the well of the humanity of this nation and have made it so, you know, a Democrat Speaker of the House could never visit a Republican president who had been assassinated or who had been shot at. You know, like you can't do that anymore because there is no civility, there is no shared vision, and there's no like desire to compromise. And this is all his legacy. And he's garbage for that. Anyway, that's my rant.
And as the film ended, the finance bros applauded, and one of them yells, "Vote Trump," and I'm like, let's run before we have to deal with these fuckers. But we needed we wanted to hit the bathroom, and then we got lost on the way. And then this bathroom, one side was labeled commodes, the other side was labeled urinals. And what I didn't realize was they shared a back. It was one restroom. So you could say that this is an example of a woke person falling on their sword. Running to the restroom when you run to the restroom with your friend, you're supposed to be able to kibitz it in there. So I was like, I hated those people so much. And they heard. Or I think they did, because when we were on our way out, the other person with a light up pen asked, they were like coming up to us. They were walking towards us with some own the libs energy. And the other person with a pen said, "Are you writing a review? I'd love to hear it." And I was like, no, because we weren't writing a review. We were making a podcast. And I just wanted to get out of there. And again, it is rude to say I hate this person when they can overhear you. I had no idea, despite having previously gotten lost trying to find this bathroom, and despite seeing the layout, I did not realize that there was no separation. This is part of why I didn't want to do things that are currently in theaters, even though getting downloads is likelier because people only care about what's new and now, and I despise that. I despise humanity for that. I couldn't care less about what's new or now. I need that freedom to react. Like, if I go to see a movie in the theater, it's usually because I expect I'll enjoy it. If I'm hate watching something, I want to be free to hate out loud the whole way through, which is why my thought was we should watch this over streaming in a few years when it happens to be free over something.
We learned.
Yeah, so it's unclear to me what inspires Dana to turn from hippiedom into backing this arch-conservative. We saw the guy who was talking to John Voight in the framing device leave with the Russian translation of this dumb book. I wrote, "This movie was a miserable experience, and it reminded me of why I never wanted to do films that are currently in theaters. If I hate a thing, I want to be free to yell at the screen and comment during it and say, fucking hated this movie loudly, and not have to deal with other people. I hate other people so much, Sarah."
I know.
Sartre was right. Hell is other people. And this goes to my theory that, like, if you are a hair and makeup person, at some point in where and how you've learned, there's probably a fabulous gay guy. And perhaps whoever worked on this had no access to that and thus did not learn to do their job at all, or they were having quiet revenge.
I think, like, what's worse about this is that I think that they were probably doing their best. I gave it a 1. Everyone looked like trash.
Yeah.
It was just such an ugly looking movie.
The script did them no favors, but it was like Voight managed to deliver the crud dialogue. Is this where we talk about the denouement of the goldfish thing?
Sure, we can talk about that. It sat on the shelf forever and it shows. I don't think it should exist. I think like the wounds are too fresh and our society is far too divided to make a biopic about Ronald Reagan that is in any way sort of like any way sort of like really examining itself. And also he's just too ripe for parody in terms of the way you can play him. I don't know. I don't like that this movie's here.
It's been accumulating 9s and 10s on IMDb quite swiftly. When I last checked, at least with one of the aggregators, the critical response was 25% and the public opinion was 97%. So those fanboys are getting on it.
Well, that's dark. No, I didn't look for anything else, but this is all pretty depressing. What you did find is a huge bummer.
Yeah, you're entitled to your opinion, but I think we are evidence this movie will not have the effect that you think it will have on the people you most wish would see it.
Again, with the media suppression. Get an ad budget. That's the problem here. It's an advertising budget issue. Anyway, you want to read the next one?
Yeah, so I'm finding more 10-star reviews on IMDb that have accumulated since last night, and some of them are pretty dreadful. If you want to go look and find another one to pick out while I read this next one.
Do you think these were all written like by the same 5 people?
I don't know. I wouldn't put it past them. So while you're looking, this next one, titled Awesome by J.G. Veith 20859. To start, Dennis Quaid knocked it out of the park. His portrayal of Ronald Reagan was spot on. I was in the U.S. Navy while Reagan was president. I was able to walk down memory lane and review history because he made history. The portrayal of Nancy, I thought, was a little off in that she seemed like a nervous Nellie, no pun intended. Nancy Reagan was his rock. I loved the way Jon Voight's character acted as a part in the movie and the living narrator. It did leave out some important historical events, but they probably didn't want to stretch the movie out for 3 or 4 hours. If you don't know a lot about Reagan or you are an admirer, go see it. You won't be disappointed. Especially take your kids, grandkids, friends, neighbors, etc. Whether they know anything about Reagan or not, even those that didn't like Reagan should go see it. Notice that there are many people that gave it low marks, but none of them left comments. So it's probably okay to ignore those ratings.
Okay, I've got one more.
Okay,
10 out of 10. Incredible. Jordan Rose, 83626. So we've got to teach history based not on what's in fashion, but what's important. Why the Pilgrims came here, who Jimmy Doolittle was, and what those 30 seconds over Tokyo meant. 4 years ago on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, 40 years ago maybe? Must have been 40. There must be a zero missing there.
D-Day was
1945.
D-Day was 1944.
Okay,
we needed a year to finish it off.
Okay, so 4 years ago.
They said 4 years, and I think they meant
40.
Well, it's 80 years ago now.
Yeah, so they're saying 4 years ago on the 40th anniversary. So I think they meant 40 years ago.
I'm so excited and disturbed that I don't remember it.
I would think that, you remember that Berlin Wall falling. I certainly don't.
I remembered that ox.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that was the 10th edition of Irrelevant Host Banter. I don't know why you're still listening. We hated Reagan a lot, but like I said, I found it comforting to go back and listen to this and remember that we're still us and we're still here. On reflection, the thing that I find truly obnoxious about the phrase own the libs is that we fought a war in this country against people owning other people. So when you say own the libs, to me at least, you're implying that you feel you have a right to do the thing that the Civil War got rid of to the person you just verbally shredded. It's unforgivable, and I curse you. May all your dreams fail. But it hurts me to say that to another human being because I see your humanity, and I want to treat others with gentleness and kindness. So here is my wish for anyone who disagrees with my horror at the terrible things that happened in Washington, D.C. on January 20th of 2025 and January 20th of 2017. I hope and wish with all my heart that tomorrow morning you will magically wake up as a liberal, and that the first words out of all your mouths are a tearful mea culpa Secretary Clinton, and that you dedicate the rest of your lives to undoing the great, grave damage that you have collectively wrought upon this nation. Okay. If you liked the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is at Biopic, a podcast story. We also have accounts on Threads and Blue Sky. Please also check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see the official episode ratings for all of the movies that we've done so far. If you would like to get in touch, you can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com. Have an excellent week or weekend, depending on when you're listening to this, and we hope that you will listen in when our regular episode drops on Tuesday. And good night to the earnest and the cynical.